Hi everyone. Hi, we're going to open up the food line in just a minute, but I just want to let anybody know if you're here for the DACA event, it's actually been moved next door. So it'll just be one over. But anybody who's here for the debate on campaign finance and free speech, you're in the right place and you can go ahead and start getting food. You can come in from this side and go down the line in the back.
That's all right. This is
So yeah, that's fine.
yeah. You want to leave plenty of time.
You just get one to start with. If we have extras, then we can give up. Okay? Thanks.
He's around here somewhere. Yeah, he should be down
Question. I see that you guys record on Surface and watch it.
Yep, have that picture. You can also add us on Facebook. Just like our
We're gonna be here.
And so when we're ready for Q&A, I'll probably do that. Still from this side.
Still, please go to that side if you don't mind. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
For lunch. Yeah, I think so. I've got a meeting I have to go to later this afternoon, but I think it'll be okay depending on this is going to go for just an hour, right? Till 1. It's sort of indefinite. I gotta check with it and see, but I think it won't be until 3. So. Oh, it's something different.
Yeah, I was like,
I did drive down there. Downtown traffic. This place, this is one thing I hate. I still go back a lot. Actually, we have a family farm up there. So that's one of the things I do manage. Not real farming. A little bit. Well, it's really just grass. I don't want to make it sound. I don't want to make it sound more aggressive than it is.
Right. My grandfather is 80 years old, or still has, I think, like 200.
Does he?
80. Yeah, and he's sell it's not good. Because we were trying to make it
picked himself up, he went to the hospital, got his hip fracture repaired, and he came back for another 6 months or so, and he was getting back into it. Right.
It's just what he's been doing. Especially with all the other stuff going on. Last year we had a lot of things. So, but when we had
Could be time to read my notes. My thoughts
Hi everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming. My name is Amanda Sauls and I'm this year's president of the Texas Federalist Society. The Federalist Society is a national network comprised of conservative and libertarian attorneys, judges, scholars, and students. And as a student chapter, the Texas Federalist Society promotes freedom, federalism, and the rule of law, and we do so through facilitating debate and discussion within the law school community. Our officer team was glad to have met so many of you at yesterday's Student Org Fair, and we're excited to have so many new members as well. If you didn't have a chance to sign up for membership yesterday or haven't yet paid your dues, at the end of the event there will be officers in the back that can help you out with that. It's not too late to sign up, and dues are only $5 for the entire year, and our VP of Membership, Austin Black, would be happy to tell you about the benefits of membership and answer any questions you might have. Today we're celebrating Constitution Day with a debate on the First Amendment and the state of campaign finance, particularly after the 2007 holding in Citizens United. And I'm going to hand it over to Ashley Trusses, our VP of Speakers, to introduce our distinguished panelists. All right, guys, so today we have with us, over here on your left, my right, David Jones. David Jones has practiced personal injury law for over 35 years in Dallas. A couple of years ago, he started devoting a substantial amount of his time to working with citizen lobby groups like Public Citizen, Common Cause, the League of Women Voters, and eventually started serving as president of Clean Elections Texas. Mr. Jones is a volunteer advocate for campaign finance reform. He has a BA from UT Austin and a JD from St. Mary's University School of Law and is board certified in personal injury trial law. We also have with us Ilya Shapiro. Ilya Shapiro is a senior fellow in constitutional studies at the Cato Institute and editor-in-chief of the Cato Supreme Court Review. Before joining Cato, he was a special assistant/advisor to the multinational force in Iraq on rule of law issues and practiced at Patton Boggs and Cleary College. He holds an AD from Princeton University, a Master of Science from the London School of Economics, and a JD from the University of Chicago Law School. Please help me in welcoming our speakers.
Thanks, Ashley. I'm Dave Jones. I think we decided I was going to go first. I'm going to talk a little bit about really how Citizens United has affected political campaigns since it was decided, and focus more on the public policy issues that are involved, and not as much on the law. I'll try to address the First Amendment issues a little bit. I am, as you heard, a personal injury lawyer, so I've been doing this for a while, but I am not a First Amendment scholar.
So if I'm in trouble, somebody make an ambulance sound somewhere, and then
I'll get up and bolt out right away. So anyway, the law, as it currently stands, is for somebody like me who's an advocate for campaign finance reform, is really not very favorable for the things that I think ought to be done. You know, when the law is not that favorable, there's what they call the lawyer's rule. If you can't argue the law, argue the facts. And the rest of it is that if you can't argue the law and you can't argue the facts, pound on the table and talk a lot louder. I won't pound on the table. I think that there are a lot of facts that, and I'm going to spend a lot of time getting into some of the details of some of the statistics of what's happened since Citizens United. And I think it really amounts to what could be evidence, in fact, of how the system has changed since Citizens United was decided, since some of the other cases that are also part of the court's jurisprudence in this area, too. It's not really fair, in my opinion, to just say Citizens United, because there's a lot of other cases that are really pertinent to a lot of these issues. But it seems like there's been a significant change since Citizens United. I want to try to show you how there's been a huge increase in the independent spending by different kinds of groups, super PACs, nonprofit corporations, trade associations, in the time since Citizens United opened the door for that increased independent spending. And I'm hoping that some of you have some familiarity, or most of you have familiarity with this issue. What happened is that there was an increase in the amount of independent spending that was permitted because of the court's decisions. And that's what we've seen, and I'm going to show that. I think that has caused a narrower, I can't say that word, narrower group of large donors to have a bigger influence in our elections. And I'm going to try to show that to you, too. I think that there is some political science evidence in the political science literature that the fact that those wealthier donors are more in charge has shifted political attitudes to some extent. I think it may have polarized our politics to some extent, but it also has just meant that there are people whose ideas are not being fairly represented in terms of how they are reflected in the electorate as a whole. I'm going to touch briefly on dark money issues. There's a question about disclosure that's also arisen since Citizens United and the fact that there are now groups that spend independent spending as well, but they don't disclose their donors. That portion of the independent spending is not as great as all the other independent spending, but I think it's important. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the First Amendment issues. Let me just tell you, and I've written a lot. I've got a lot of notes because I can't remember all these statistics, so bear with me on that. But let me just give you a picture of how much the outside spending has increased since Citizens United. In 2010, there was $205 million in independent spending in that cycle. In 2012, there was $1 billion spent independently. In the 2014 cycle, it dropped down because it was an off-year election to $548 million. But then back in this last cycle in 2016, there was $1.4 billion in independent spending that occurred. That's like a 30% increase from the 2014. So it's had an impact on our politics. The Brennan Center at NYU has done a number of studies in this area, and they examined the money spent on key contested U.S. Senate races. And in 2016, in those key contested races, 51% of the spending was from independent groups as compared to only 43% by the candidates themselves. So less money is being spent by the candidates, more money is being spent out on the outside, and they're getting to be almost identical amounts in elections. Initially, the thought was that independent expenditures, and of course this is part of the court's rationale, is that those independent expenditures would be truly independent. They'd be separate from traditional spending. And there was some concern that the political parties would be disadvantaged by that. And that maybe was true at first. In my opinion, though, and I think the statistics bear this out, what's happened in recent years is that each of the parties have developed what people call shadow party PACs. They're independent spending organizations that really are reflective of the parties themselves. The Democrats have something called the Senate Majority PAC. In the Senate, the Republicans have the Senate Leadership Fund, just as an example. And those funds are run typically by staff that were previously involved with the party or the party committees, or staff of the leadership in either party. And they have quite a bit of affiliation as far as their between to work with the parties. Now, the FEC rules are there's not supposed to be coordination between these independent groups and the folks, especially when we're talking about candidates. But there's a lot of de facto coordination, I would argue, that occurs anyway. The other thing that's happened is that now candidates almost always in significant races have what they call buddy PACs, which are like an independent spending super PAC that works for the election of the senator or congressman, and it's the same situation. A lot of times they're staffed by people who used to work for the congressman. They use the same PR firms. They use the same polling firms. There's not supposed to be coordination, but there's a lot of that goes on. And interestingly enough, I think that there's some evidence that they are actually coordinating their activities with the the actual traditional PACs and the traditional candidate campaigns, because they seem to, when you look back on the elections that have occurred, they seem to have targeted the same races. The parties choose particular races. I mean, some of that's fairly obvious a lot of times, but it's still, those choices are made. The percentage allocation that they make to different races is very similar. There's just a lot of similarities. So that arm of the independent spending has increased so much that I think it's become a factor. And it's resulted in a very narrow group of large donors who are the supporters of these independent expenditure PACs having a lot of influence. I think the best way to show you is to talk about a specific example. In the last election cycle, Senator Rob Portman from Ohio had a super PAC that was run by a veteran of his prior campaigns. It's called the Fighting for Ohio Fund. And over 80% of its funding came from just 32 contributors who gave $100,000 or more. This tech investor, Peter Thiel, gave $1 million. Hedge fund guy gave like $250,000. And then there was, as an interesting twist on all this, also there was a corporation that a nonprofit 501c4 corporation called Freedom Vote Incorporated that gave $1.7 million. And because of, and I won't go into all the FEC machinations of why this has occurred, but the bottom line is most of those donors to that corporation are not disclosed. And so people who donate to super PACs directly, individuals, those folks' identities are known and disclosed. But there's sort of a gray area where people can, or corporations can give to super PACs, and it's not all disclosed. That PAC, Fighting for Ohio, spent more on negative advertisements than Portman's opponent, Governor Ted Strickland, spent on his entire campaign. So it's a significant impact. The super PACs have been bankrolled by these narrow group of donors. Since 2010, fewer than 200 people and their spouses have provided nearly 60% of all the super PAC spending. So it's a very narrow group of people. That's a shift in I think what we've seen, and it also defeats some of the rationale, in my view, for independent spending and permitting that spending. Because those same people also are huge donors to the traditional PACs and to the traditional parties and the candidates themselves. And what typically happens is that they max out in their traditional donations as much as they can, or they do a great deal, and these large donors also then contribute to the super PACs. So that's a significant aspect of it. This happens on both sides. It happens with Republicans and Democrats. This is another example. The Priorities USA Action PAC, the super PAC that backed Hillary Clinton, was guided by some former staffers, and there were like 15 individuals in 2015 who contributed over $1 million to that effort. And so a lot of the support comes from a fairly narrow group. I think that's caused an impact that's really important, there's a lot of literature that has begun to be done in the political science area about the preferences of wealthy donors, especially extremely wealthy donors, versus the preferences of middle-class citizens and low-income citizens. And there are differences in their policy preferences that's been shown in some of the political science literature, and where those policy priorities are different, it's also been shown that the policy preferences of the wealthy folks seem to prevail. So that's an important factor as well. Just briefly, let me tell you a little more about the dark money situation as far as money that's not disclosed. These 501c4s and 501c6 corporations are able to, with some narrow exceptions, to not disclose their donors. And they have become an important factor in that they have concentrated their efforts, even though their spending is quite a bit less, in some narrowly targeted races, and it's been fairly successful. And that's contrary to what the court clearly said in Citizens United. Citizens United was 8-1 in favor of disclosure, and there's a lot of interesting things to talk about there as well. I don't want to go over my time. I can see Ashley's looking at me here. I think that, there's an issue of whether the First Amendment has been strengthened or weakened by these activities. And to me, I think that question is resolved by it depends who you are. If you have money to spend, then your First Amendment rights as an individual have been strengthened. If you don't have money to spend, I don't think they have been strengthened. I think they've probably been weakened because of the dominance of other groups. Now, I trace that to me to what the court has done as far as how it defines corruption, and the fact that it has narrowed the definition of corruption to just quid pro quo corruption, and it has dismissed, in fact overruled, previous cases that permitted consideration of undue influence and access as a consideration of whether that could have an influence on the issue of corruption or the appearance of corruption. I think that's an important thing as well. I think I've talked long enough. I appreciate y'all being here. Thank you, Ashley. I'll wait till later.
All right, well, thanks for having me back. Last time I think I spoke to you, I think it might have been even in this room, I started with a projection of my Texas-shaped waffle and describing how that relates to districting. Unfortunately, I got no good ideas for my breakfast this morning, so we'll just have to make do with my telling you about these things. And I guess I'll begin with this great report by CNN that came out less than a week after the election, titled "The Year When Money Won Nobody Nothing." So this is not Breitbart, this is not Fox News, this is not Reason Magazine, these are not crazy libertarians or whatnot, but it shows how there's essentially no correlation between who raised more and who won, whether you're talking about congressional races or you're talking about the Republican primaries or the general election. I'll get to some actual stats in a moment, but everyone's kind of scratching their heads, and donors are thinking, what are we wasting our money on? Makes us feel good, I suppose, but it doesn't really move the ball. Once you get past a certain threshold, if you have zero money, then you're not going to be very successful even running for a dog catcher or what have you. But past a certain threshold, the extra dollar isn't worth as much as good strategy and making sure you go to Wisconsin, these sorts of things. Right? Were any of you fans of the old Colbert Report or the Jon Stewart Daily Show? Not the current one. I know we're getting, y'all are very young and everything, so you might not even remember this. I don't know if you're middle school when Colbert had his previous show, but
I don't remember.
Yeah, well, I'm a little biased because Colbert had me on his show and Stewart didn't, but regardless, they, more than any media pundits, real or fake news pundits, showed the unworkability of campaign finance regulations. I, in fact, agree with probably the only thing we agree on with Mr. Jones, that the current system is broken. Now, of course, Colbert and Stewart didn't cover the law, and neither am I, frankly, going to get too much into the intricacies of First Amendment law, although it's not really that complicated in this area. And while my diagnosis of the problems with our system, and therefore my prescription for reform, is different from theirs and from Mr. Jones's, I do agree that our current structures and incentives lead to often perverse and sometimes comical results. Now, I do think that Citizens United was correctly decided, simply because political speech should be free regardless of the nature of the speaker. People don't lose their rights when they get together and either speak or do other constitutionally protected activities, whether it's through unions or nonprofit advocacy groups or private clubs or just a group of friends meeting informally. But I also think that Citizens United created the odd situation whereby independent political speech is mostly unbridled and unrestricted now, while candidates and parties are still heavily restricted and regulated. Now, candidates and parties shouldn't get any special solicitude under the Constitution. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. The parties aren't supposed to be privileged, but there is a weird dynamic. I mean, when you think about it, who benefited from Citizens United? It's not political parties, one or the other, and it's also not kind of for-profit Fortune 500 corporations. It's independent speaking groups, whether you're talking about Heritage Action or the Center for American Progress Action, or Planned Parenthood, or the NRA, or business associations, these sorts of organizations. It's not evil companies like Exxon or Halliburton, or even good ones like Apple or whoever your favorite for-profit corporation that are all of a sudden speaking more on these issues. It's more these independent advocacy groups of various kinds. But as I said, there's a weird dynamic because a system where there's strict limits on contributions to candidates, but not on their expenditures, and no limits on independent groups' contributions or expenditures, I don't think it's stable. But let me step back before I get into why and just explain Citizens United, because whether you think you're in favor or against that case, chances are you're probably misunderstanding something about it. Even say former constitutional scholar at my alma mater, Barack Obama, his statement at the 2010 State of the Union, where he said that, quote, Citizens United reverse a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates of special interest, including foreign corporations, to spend without limits in our elections. That simple statement contained 4 errors of law. First of all, the case didn't overturn a century of law, but about 20 years. Obama was referring to the Tillman Act, which banned corporate donations to candidates back in 1907. That was not touched. Corporations, whether for-profit, non-profit, advocacy, or otherwise, still can't donate to campaigns. Instead, what the case did was overturn a case called Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce from 1990, which for the first and only time allowed the regulation of political speech for a reason other than corruption or the quid pro quo corruption or the appearance thereof, the kind of a leveling the playing field sort of argument. So that really was the anomaly, Austin was. As far as opening the floodgates to special interests, it depends on how you define those terms. There's actually not been any sort of geometric or exponential increase in spending by corporations, although there has been by unions. There are now people running super PACs who would otherwise be bundlers or running regular old PACs. But it's unclear that any floodgates have been opened. There's a shift in where money went, where it wouldn't otherwise go. But the total money, the trend of increase is there's not been some sort of inflection point after Citizens United. The rights of foreigners, also an issue on which Citizens United said nothing, and indeed 2 years later, in 2012, the Supreme Court summarily affirmed a case that ruled that green card holders and others currently green card holders and citizens are the only people who can donate to candidates. Some people who are here on other types of visas wanted to do that, and the court rejected their challenge. And this issue that spending on election now has no limits. Well, again, that's not true. There are very strict limits regarding who, and how much you can donate to candidates and parties. And so Citizens United, and then a follow-on case in the DC Circuit called SpeechNow.org, what they resulted in is that the court definitively stated that the only rationale for sustaining campaign finance regulations was to prevent corruption and the appearance thereof. And people can get together, if there's a bunch of friends who each have $1,000, they can spend the same as one very rich person who has $10,000. No restrictions on that. But we have been hearing a lot, including Mr. Jones's presentation, about super PACs, that they're some sort of weird or new kind of evil, a different kind, not just a different degree of money in our politics. And that actually, the idea of super PACs generated a lot of the discussion on Stewart and Colbert. There was this one skit where originally Colbert was running a super PAC called Americans for a Better Tomorrow, right? But then he decided to run for President of the United States in South Carolina. And so he had to transfer control of the super PAC to Stewart, so they kind of held hands, and this animated money flew from Colbert to Stewart, and then Stewart says, I have the power. It's kind of ridiculous, right? Because Stewart knows what Colbert's intentions were going to be, and even if they don't communicate, you know, they're long-term business partners and business associates, and you know, Colbert even has on his TV show, he could say something like, well, I wish someone would, you know, put up an ad saying blah, 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 and Stewart could say that, you know, see that as an instruction and stuff like that. I mean, it really is ridiculous rules, these kind of anti-coordination things, or, you know, whether you're talking about Ted Cruz or Hillary Clinton super PACs, you know, there's all these rules that, you know, you can't coordinate, you can't talk to people on the actual campaign, there's a several-month cooling off period. But come on, this is not rocket science about what sorts of things would benefit. But remember that the reason for these nonsensical regulations is that the law restricts donations to candidates, but not to independent groups. That's what's kind of creating these kind of perverse incentives. And it's not at all clear that that kind of anti-coordination policing is doing all that much, or that Citizens United, for that matter, is responsible for the perversion. In 2012, it wasn't corporate spending, the first presidential election after Citizens United, but good old billionaires that were responsible for a lot of the money in politics talk that we had. Rick Santorum, Newt Gingrich, Ron Paul, remember them in kind of our more conventional political era? Each of them had one big billionaire supporter who kept them in the race much longer than they would have otherwise. Now, you know, those billionaires did create super PACs at the time, but they didn't need to, because if you're one really rich person, you can run your ads or do whatever without setting up a super PAC. Super PAC just allows you to aggregate funds from other people, but they could have been doing that even without Citizens United. 2016, last cycle, really proved that both the impact and the supposed partisan advantages of super PACs have not only been wildly exaggerated, but are just plain wrong. Hillary Clinton raised a total of, between party, candidate, and super PACs, $1.4 billion. Donald Trump raised $958 million. In the Republican primaries, by far the richest candidate with the biggest super PAC was Jeb Bush. Please clap. Then Ted Cruz, all right, then Marco Rubio, like all the way down was Trump with almost nothing. So anyway, you know, this is, you know, you see that the importance of celebrity and other things are much more important past a certain threshold than money. So what does this all mean for the brave new world after Citizens United, after 2016? How much of a problem are super PACs? I mean, why do we even care that people are spending independently? You know, why would we want to channel that money to candidates in campaigns more directly instead? If the problem is insufficient disclosure rules, then let's have a debate about that. I mean, I would prefer personally a system where you would have essentially unlimited donations to candidates, but disclosures for the very rich, for the very high donations, whether, you know, calibrated based on the race, and, you know, some sort of political compromise could be worked out there, whether it's $100,000 or $1 million threshold for presidential races or what have you. Ted Cruz, I think, has proposed something like this. But you know, it's at a certain point where the interest in having the public think of the election campaigns as having integrity outweighs the risk of harassment and retaliation for small donors. You know, even, you know, the current level of limit for individual donations to federal candidates is, I think, $2,700 next cycle. Well, even $2,700 from, you know, a lawyer or whoever, a Goldman Sachs banker, is not going to corrupt any particular candidate. While knowing that might expose that person to all sorts of opprobrium and boycotts and things like that. I don't know what else the problem would be, because it seems hard to argue that independent political speech isn't protected by the First Amendment. When you think about that, right? Why was the First Amendment put in? To protect unpopular, mostly political speech at the time of the Revolution. To think that independent speech is not protected is a non-starter. No, I think the real culprit in our ridiculous situation is the pretense that policing coordination between candidates and super PACs eliminates the appearance of corruption. And the real culprit there is not Citizens United. You have to go back to the dawn of the modern age of campaign finance and the FECA, the Federal Election Campaign Act, after Watergate, and Buckley versus Vallejo, the 1976 Supreme Court case that basically rewrote FECA. It's kind of like Obamacare. Well, we'll rewrite this part and uphold this and strike down that, creating a piece of legislation no Congress would have passed. But anyway, there you go. They upheld restrictions on candidate donations, struck down restrictions on expenditures, and kind of tweaked public funding issues. And that created warped incentives. The court produced a system where candidates face an unlimited demand for campaign funds, but a tapered supply. And that's why political candidates spend all their time dialing for dollars and fundraising. Now, some people might think, well, that's good. That means they can't create as much mischief legislating or doing other things that politicians might be doing. But nevertheless, is that a feature or a bug? But that's why they spend all their time fundraising. President Eisenhower, when he was running, had 5 big donors who took care of the money for him, and that was it. Hubert Humphrey, the insurgent campaign against Lyndon Johnson in 1968, not Hubert Humphrey, Gene McCarthy, would not have been possible without a handful of large donors. He couldn't have done it under the current regime. Campaign regulation, trying to manage the flow of political speech, is a graveyard of well-intentioned ideas. Reformist ideals always go awry because political money is like water. It's going to chase these important public policy issues that politicians affect. I mean, ultimately, if it doesn't go to candidates, it'll go to parties, and if not there, to independent speakers. Why? Because what the government does matters. If you really want to get money out of politics, reduce the size of politics. If the federal government didn't have so much power over everything all the time, fewer people would donate to try to influence or get whatever result they want. Shrink the size of government and its intrusions in people's lives, and you'll definitely shrink the amount of money in politics. And even if you're concerned about the money spent on electioneering, even though Americans spend more money on Halloween candy, we're 6 weeks away from Halloween, Americans spend more on Halloween candy and chewing gum than on campaigns, the problem isn't the big corporate players, as I said, Exxon and Halliburton or Apple or whoever. These companies spend little money on political ads. First, because it's much more effective for them to lobby on the back end, and lobbying is much more restricted and full disclosures and all of those sorts of things. But also because, as Michael Jordan said, Republicans buy sneakers too. Fortune 500 companies are wary of pissing off half of their potential customers, so they don't want to get involved. Target, for example, had some issues where they tried to fund candidates that would help them on the economic side, but it turns out those candidates had controversial social positions, and so they shied away from that. On the other hand, groups composed of many individuals and smaller players of various kinds now do get to speak more, whether that's, as I said, the NRA or Planned Parenthood or other advocacy organizations. They can't compete with those big boys, the Exxons and the Apples and the Facebooks. But they sure as hell are going to make the public aware of Congress's shenanigans. So even if we accept leveling the playing field as a proper reason for campaign finance regulation, Citizens United's freeing up of associational speech does level that playing field in many ways. So anyway, at a certain point, enough Democratic incumbents are going to be annoyed that they've lost control of their message, that all these independent speakers are controlling all of their races. And from there, reform will come. It's not going to be the people that are constantly obsessed with campaign finance, who only, I think, exist within the Beltway. But until then, we're left with a system that's unbalanced, unstable, and unworkable. And I would wager, as I said, that we'll see some sort of fundamental transformation, even in the next decade, from incumbents who feel threatened that they've lost control of their messaging. And then Stephen Colbert and others would have to focus on other things, but I'm confident that they will find something else to ridicule, and the rest of us will be better off. Thanks.
I'm supposed to talk for about 5 minutes as a rebuttal, so I guess I'm one of those people who obsesses about campaign finance reform, maybe outside the Beltway. I'm in Dallas. I think there are areas where we may have some agreement. And I do think that I agree that there has been instability inserted in the system because of the way it's structured as it is. I'm not against independent spending. I think most of the people who are reform advocates understand the importance of there being a need for independent spending. It's just the fact that it has gotten out of hand, and it has, to me personally, the biggest concern is that it's a narrow group of extremely wealthy donors who are able to give large amounts of money to these different types of entities, a 501c4, a super PAC, and because of that have the potential at least for excessive influence. I think there's like I said, the political science research is mixed to some extent. I think I guess I may be biased by my viewpoint, but I think there's some pretty good evidence that those wealthy donors have an influence on policy. But it just makes sense that if you're able to spend literally millions and millions of dollars to a super PAC that really is just a wink and a nod away from the candidate himself or herself, then you're going to have an influence on policy. So I want to address the one issue about that Ilya said about donations to candidates and the fact that those are limited. I don't know that I agree that the instability is because they're so limited. What's happened since Citizens United is, of course, the McCutcheon case against the FEC that permitted a broadening of the different donations that people with the money to give can make. They can give to multiple candidates and to different types of party organizations. Subsequent to McCutcheon, there was a spending bill, a continuing resolution budget reconciliation bill that everybody calls it the Cromnibus bill in 2014, that expanded the amount that can be given directly to party committees. So they set up certain specific party committees, and there's been some significant increase in joint funding committees that work between these different organizations and are able to transfer money that's given directly to the candidates. So it's really not just Citizens United, it's McCutcheon, it's Cromnibus that has expanded the ability for people who have the wherewithal to do it to put a lot of their money into politics. And I have concerns about that because I think, that the court really wanted to protect the individual. And I think it's fair to say you look at the rationale of the court in Citizens United, and then also in McCutcheon, the Chief Justice was real clear about his concern that there is this need to protect the individual, and just because somebody like Dave Jones from Dallas thinks that it's good public policy to do this, it shouldn't be enough of a reason to limit the speech of an individual. And what I feel like has happened is that there's a gap there in that logic, and that is that the individuals who are not wealthy, who don't have the wherewithal to spend, are being disadvantaged, and their freedom of speech is effectively limited. And it may be because they can't buy up all the ad time before the election like wealthy super PACs can do, so that those folks can't have input in that way. It may be just, and this is really probably a more important thing, it may be just that how the impact that all this has on the candidates and on the political parties and the influence of those folks. So
I'm going to open up for questions. I just want to make one point about why donors donate and what they expect when they donate. It's not like, candidates are all blank slates, but then they start getting donations and that's how they shape their views. It's not like Ted Cruz didn't care about the Constitution until some of his donors said, oh, you better be strong about the separation of powers and federalism. He said, oh, gosh, yes. And the Second Amendment, oh, that's important. Donors sort themselves out based on the policies that they like from the particular candidates. And the very rich, it's a luxury good, and it's kind of a signaling thing, and they like to think of themselves as players or whatnot. So I think it's overblown, this idea that candidates are even being corrupted when they associate with these donors and whatnot. Some of these theories of corruption, the McCutcheon case was, there used to be a limit on the total amount you could donate to all candidates. So basically you could max out to, forget how the math worked out, 18. But if you gave $1 more to the 19th candidate, all of a sudden you're corrupting the system. It's kind of an odd theory. But anyway, let's hear some questions.
Okay, we have some time for questions. Go ahead.
You kind of referenced Mr. Shapiro, the political parties as being regulated in some sort of sense, but political parties kind of at their face value have a foot in both the private and the public sphere. And that way, I would see that these private citizens who are coming together in these super PACs are kind of still living in both the private and public sphere way, similar to the political parties, Democrat, Republican. And if we're able to regulate the way the parties work, why can't we regulate this kind of gray area between both public and private spheres that exist as well with the super PACs?
Well, I don't know what you mean exactly by public and private sphere. The reason why political parties are regulated isn't because they speak, it's because they pick candidates and they're involved in voting. And we want to prevent corruption in voting and things like that. So it's not that political parties are even restricted in how much ad time they can buy or things like that. What restrictions there are is on coordination with campaigns and on how much someone can donate to them. Again, because of the concern that corrupting parties will lead to buying candidates and things like that. Whereas with independent speakers, they're independent groups. They're not entities that are so integrally involved in the voting process, not in the campaigning process, but in the voting process. And so, look, I mean, I would rather just as much not draw a distinction, and as I said, remove the limits on donations to parties and things like that, because I think regulating voting rules, districting, whether you have voter ID or not, I mean, all those sorts of things, what kind of machines you have, that's a separate animal than regulating campaign finance. So, I would rather actually go in the other direction than what you're suggesting, and not start regulating more speech, but regulating less speech.
Okay, so this is for Mr. Jones. So, if your issue is getting money out of politics, how do you feel about news that portrays itself as objective, but when you analyze it, it's completely subjective and almost propaganda? So the shows have a financial value associated with them. So, are you in favor of also limiting what people on the news can say? Because essentially they're making donations to campaigns.
Absolutely not. I'm not in favor of that at all. I think that when you start talking about the press, it's a very different issue. And I mean, I understand that there's a lot of disappointment with the press. There's a lot of feeling of bias. There's lots of discussion of fake news and all the other things that we hear about. But the press is the press, and I think it's a mistake to try to regulate that in any meaningful way. Now, I do agree they have a lot of influence.
But what about people who support the press through buying ad space? So, like, if Exxon wants to give $1 million for ad space on Fox, so are they not technically making a donation because they like the message, the political message?
I think that's a good point.
The thing about the press exemption from the rule that corporations can't donate even in kind to campaigns is that what is the press? What is the media? Okay, so the New York Times, when they write an editorial endorsing someone, that's not considered, that's exempt from regulation. But okay, so now probably bloggers are also. But what about a situation where you have, say, Siemens, German conglomerate, right? They might have their own corporate blog or what have you, and they don't get an exemption because they're not the media, they're not the press, they're a manufacturing company, right? But what about their big competitor, GE, which owns NBC and some other press organizations. All of a sudden, GE can have an advantage over Siemens because they have a quote-unquote press arm. So you raise an important point in that I think this media versus non-media corporation distinction as well, I don't think is ultimately tenable.
I think it's problematic. I just think it's really scary to try to regulate it.
So I guess actually I have two questions. The first one's for Mr. Shapiro. Earlier you said that there's this idea that there's sort of no spending on elections, but on the contrary, there's a very strict spending limit on candidates. It seems to me like candidates and elections are separate. Candidates spend on elections, but other people can now spend on elections. I guess if we could clarify that. And the second one was Mr. Shapiro mentioned fears about foreign spending, and it seems to me that previously it was mentioned also the ability to donate to nonprofits without any disclosure that can then donate to super PACs. What is there anything that, and that one would be for both of y'all, is there anything that limits foreign spender from donating to a political campaign in that group?
On the first question, spending on candidates versus spending on elections, I don't understand. I'm sorry, I don't understand what.
Sorry, the way you phrased it was that there's this idea that there's now no cap on spending on elections, but on the contrary, there's actually there's a very strict limitation on spending on candidates, and it sounded as if maybe those were being conflated in your speech, and I was wondering if that was on purpose or if there's something that we're not.
I said that there's no limits on donations to independent groups, but there remain limits on donations to candidates and campaigns and parties. That was one of the kind of distinctions. So the money now flows more towards independent speakers because that speech is less regulated. So I don't know if that answers your question. Just explains it something that I'm a little clear. And the second question was about 501c4s.
Yeah. So earlier it was discussed that there are 501c4s and I think 501c6s as well. Don't have to disclose their donors, but they can make donations to super PACs. So is there anything that stops, say, a wealthy individual in Saudi Arabia or Russia or Germany or Mexico or wherever from donating to a 501c4 and then that money going to a super PAC? There doesn't seem to be any point at which someone will be like, oh wait, like step A is allowed, step B is allowed, but together they technically aren't allowed. There doesn't seem to be any way to.
Yeah, there's some weird things in the tax code. I think if you're a nonprofit, you're a nonprofit. These kind of social welfare organizations, that there are a lot of regulations there that are kind of confusing. But there's nothing to stop the Saudi. I mean, you don't even have to go through the C4. You can have the Saudi Arabian donating to a super PAC himself. There's not restrictions on that. What the restrictions are is donating to campaigns and parties and candidates. At the end of the day, if you think that you can look up the officers of any given super PAC, of any given C4, hold them responsible for something that you think is being some message that's not appropriate. But on the independent side, I don't think there's an advantage per se to trying to find extra steps before donating. Foreigners do have free speech rights. I only became a citizen 3 years ago. Like most immigrants, I do a job that native-born Americans won't, and that's defending the Constitution. But even when I wasn't, even when I didn't have a green card, I couldn't donate to candidates, but I could certainly speak. I could take out ads, I suppose. And whether you're Saudi or Russian or Chinese, you can still do that. Citizens United didn't affect that one way or another.
But there are regulations that forbid foreign spending when it's directly given to candidates. I mean, you can't.
Again, it wasn't affected by CE.
Foreign entities, this has existed before. It's not directly related to Citizens United, but I mean, it's one of the concerns, and I think, I mean, you were sort of criticizing President Obama's State of the Union address, and I kind of agree he may have overstepped some of his bounds. I'm not partisan really that much one way or another, but I think that he did make a statement about foreign entities in that speech, and there is some concern because they can give to these relatively dark organizations where their giving is not disclosed, and it's a way for foreign money to get into our elections without people knowing about it. And of course, there's a whole other issue of foreign corporations that that are able to donate through 501c6 trade associations, for instance, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, nobody knows who gives to that for their political spending. And foreign corporations can do that as well. And so they're not visible. And I think there's a risk in that. And that's an issue that exists. It's not necessarily related to Citizens United, but it's an important issue.
I think Zuckerberg's race is quite emblematic of the campaign finance and First Amendment. Do you see any way that virtual democracy and real-time voting, decentralized blockchain might have a way to kind of combat this floodgates? And what would it look like each, a like for like a vote or a retweet, a statistical count of retweets in a certain area for a certain candidate? Can you comment on that and see how that unfolds in the future?
I'm a simple constitutional lawyer, and I don't understand most of what you're proposing. So are you saying that Zuckerberg is going to convince us to vote somehow?
Well, yeah, so he's got Facebook. If he blocks, there's a case made that actually Facebook got Trump elected. You could now make the case that he could block every other, candidate and only put good things about himself, and you can only like things about Zuckerberg and nobody else in the world.
Well, the only way to prevent or restrict or regulate that kind of action is through antitrust laws, not through campaign finance regulations. If you're saying that he's abusing monopoly power in some way, that's a very hard case to make out. Whenever someone achieves monopoly power, I mean, very soon, faster than the law operates in terms of a lawsuit or government investigation, some new thing will disrupt that and obviate the problem. We're no longer concerned about Microsoft monopoly or IBM or AT&T or all of these sorts of things, or the railroads, right? I'm sure there are going to be new issues that arise, and we'll have to deal with them as they come up. A lot of these things are cultural, and the law won't really have a role to play, but perhaps. And the nature of political campaigns will change, probably. Yeah, that's about as much as I can say to that.
Let me just say, if I may, that I think one of the things we may agree on is that the money finds a way a lot of times, and so it's constantly with new innovations, the things that might be available to try to promote candidates on the internet or through Facebook or whatever. That's something that, as it occurs, may have to be addressed. I mean, I think that it's almost like whack-a-mole when you're talking about campaign money. I mean, it does pop up, but I don't think that, and this is where we would disagree probably, is that I don't think you should stop whacking the mole. I mean, I think that you just got to try to limit it in order to protect people, because the money matters, and it finds a way, but it's. I mean, people have a right to spend their money in politics, but this is contrary to the constitutional law as it exists right now from the United States Supreme Court, but I think there should be ways to limit spending.
I think you should reduce the mole's feedstock. That's how you ultimately get it.
We can maybe do one more. Anybody else have a question? If not, we can. Okay. Oh, you got a question? Wait, who said that? Oh, never mind. Okay, so let's thank our speaker.